And is that full screen on the picture?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll give this just a second. It's 7 o'clock and we've got the gang. This is a good turnout.
I think there's some MOU people on
Never had that.
because I forwarded to MOU.
I was gonna say something happened. We've been averaging 45. We just hit 60 and we haven't even
Yeah,
hit weight people.
well, there's like 900 people on the MOU listserv, but
Yep.
I don't think they'll all show up.
Yeah, we invited 1,300 out of our list plus that 900. This will be fun.
Do you have a limit on this Zoom?
100.
Oh,
To get
It's a
over
great
100
picture.
costs, Zoom is charging a lot of money to get over 100.
What?
Depends on the type of
this is a
culture.
weird deal.
Oh, they
Yeah,
can-
I hadn't anticipated the problem for that 101st person. We'll see what happens. Oh.
Who knew Madagascar would be the big draw?
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
I think we're all hoping to escape from our daily life.
A snowy Minnesota, yes.
Well, it's a little after 7. Should I go ahead and do the introduction?
Go ahead and introduce, and people will show up as they need to. Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. My name is Stuart Korn, and I'm on the programs chair. I'm on the programs committee, rather, and we have today Dr. Sushma Reddy from the Bell Museum. She's the Breckenridge Chair of Ornithology at the Bell Museum and is a teacher at the University of Minnesota. She received her PhD from Columbia University, and after that, she spent time at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Field Museum of Natural History, and most recently was on the faculty at Loyola University in Chicago. And she's going to talk to us about the birds of Madagascar. Please remember to keep your phones muted. If you have a question, you can ask it at the end, or you can type it into the chat and I will summarize or read it at the end. Thank you. Go ahead, Sushma, thanks.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you all for coming. I hope that in this presentation, I can give you a chance, a small respite from the cold and from the drudgery of being in a lockdown, and take you away, transport you virtually to a tropical island and show you some cool things. Before I start, I do want to just acknowledge that all of my research that I will be showing you relies very much on museum specimens. And so I'd like to acknowledge the fact that many people have contributed to what we know about the birds in Madagascar, and many people have contributed to the collections, that the natural history collections that we use to and are the real basis of what we do here. Ooh, did something happen? I think I lost my screen.
I did too.
I'm gonna try one more time.
Ben, all I'm seeing is Zoom 5 is here.
Yeah, I see the screen, but that's a screen share. Robert Jansen,
Yes,
can you please stop sharing?
how do I do that? I got it. There.
I will get a setting that nobody else can turn that accidentally on. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead and reshare your screen, Dr. Reddy. That was someone else's screen somehow accidentally got shared, it looks like.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Do you see my slides
Yes.
again? Okay, great. So, so we think of islands as natural laboratories. And this is because these isolated land masses, you can have evolution occurring in isolation in ways where there are fewer species that can get to these islands. And once they get there, they have reduced pressures from predators or reduced competition from other related species. And so we see evolution happening in islands often in ways that are much faster and more dramatic than we would see in other areas. And this we know most famously from Darwin's finches. Right? Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands have been this classic example of how fast bill shape can change in response to environmental changes. And we can see a similar diversity of bill shapes and sizes in response to resources available in the Hawaiian Islands when we look at the Hawaiian honeycreepers. And so here's another slide that shows you just the dramatic evolution that can happen. And these are birds that are changing in response to food resources. So nectivorous birds tend to have these curved bills. Seed-eating birds have thick conical bills. And so, the same, all of these species share a common ancestor, and they were able to evolve into these different forms. And so islands can really show us how evolution happens, and it can often do that much faster than we see in other places, or more dramatically, I would say. And what I'm going to do today is talk to you about Madagascar and talk to you about some of the lineages there and show you some similar types of dramatic evolutionary events. So Madagascar, as you all know, is this island here off the coast of Africa. And you probably know it most famously for its lemurs. These are a group of primates that are found nowhere else in the world except in Madagascar. And this, that's the same kind of sense you get from a lot of the plants and animals that live in this biodiversity hotspot. It's really exciting because this area is unique in holding plants and animals that are found nowhere else in this world, the world. And so the sense of endemism is really important when we think about Madagascar. And the other thing that's really exciting is not only are there species that are found nowhere else in the world, but we also see that they have diversified, become multiple species while they were in Madagascar in ways that are much larger radiations than we would have expected in other places. And so we see a really dramatic radiation of lemurs that fill multiple types of niches. And similarly for this group of chameleons, you see a wide variety of sizes and shapes and colors, including the world's smallest vertebrate, four-legged vertebrate, the Brookesia, which can fit at the tip of your finger. So, really quite dramatic radiation, and also really strange things such as these baobabs, which are really quite awesome if you get a chance to see them. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about my research. I study birds, and I aim to study birds in terms of how they've evolved on Madagascar. And I'm looking at questions such as how many endemic radiations there are, and ask questions of how they've diversified, what changes have happened, why these changes might have happened, and also looking at questions of why some species just fail to diversify, right? So in my talk today, I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the island and its birds, and I'm going to give you some of the results of our research so far in terms of understanding how birds have evolved on this island. And I'm going to end with some conservation issues that I think are really important for us all to understand. And I hope that at the end, we'll have lots of time for questions. And I apologize if you hear my dog in the background whining. So Madagascar became an island with the breakup of Gondwana. It used to be part of the supercontinent of Gondwana back in the Mesozoic era. And after the supercontinent started breaking up, the this landmass of Madagascar became isolated. So about 100 million years ago is when it broke off from Africa. And about 88 million years ago is when it broke off from India. And that was the last time it was connected to any other landmass. And this period, this time period of 88 million years is still fairly distant in the past. And this is before we think that modern birds and mammals, the groups that we're familiar with today, even evolved. So what did the island look like? Well, we know from a lot of fossils that around the late Cretaceous, that Madagascar had a fairly rich dinosaur and crocodilian fauna, basically. I'm sure there were lots of other things. I'm a little bit biased towards vertebrates and bird relatives. And so as you can see here from some of these reconstructions, there was quite a diversity of different kinds of animals, different kinds of dinosaurs. And I think there are two things that are really important to note here. One, that it's quite diverse, right? We have members of the sauropods, the herbivorous dinosaurs. We have members of the carnivorous dinosaurs, the theropods. There's quite a lot of variation in size and behavior in these dinosaurs, which tells you that it was a very rich ecosystem. And the other thing to note is that just like some of the modern groups that I was telling you about before, the dinosaurs also seem to have evolved really unique characteristics that are unusual and not found in their counterparts in other parts of the world. And so, for example, this Myzicasaurus has this really crazy jaw that juts out in this funny way, and that's something that's quite unique in dinosaurs. Of course, we know that all non-avian dinosaurs go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. And this is also the time that modern birds, the groups that we're familiar with and that are still living today, begin to really diversify. So if Madagascar was already an island when modern birds and modern mammals evolved, how did these species get there? Right? And so we think that they probably got there either by accidentally being blown off course while they were flying. So they were flying and accidentally got blown off by the wind and into the island, or they rafted. And rafting means that either a storm or something uproots a bunch of vegetation, plants, trees, and lots of other things. And this can actually create a floating island that other animals can be on. And this can float over across the ocean and end up landing on different islands. And we know this occurs. We've observed this in storms in the Caribbean. And so this is a viable hypothesis of how animals can get to oceanic islands. And when we but another thing that's surprising in Madagascar is that it doesn't seem like there are as many plants and animals as we should expect, given how close it is to Africa. And one of the reasons we think that is because for the long period in the Cenozoic, the wind patterns were actually wind patterns and ocean current patterns were actually going from east to west, so in the wrong direction for enabling dispersal from Africa. And so we see this in terms of the fact that there are very few dispersal events from Africa into Madagascar. And this is most dramatic when we look at the mammals. So all the mammals that live on Madagascar today are all derivatives from just 4 successful lineages, right? 4 times that primates, tenrecs, which are a group of insectivores, rodents, and carnivores, a group of weasels, actually were able to cross the Mozambique Channel by rafting over and getting to Madagascar. And once they got there, they were able to really make use of all the resources there, all the open niches, and really be able to diversify and fill lots of different roles that they didn't have a chance to do in Africa. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about the birds that made it over to Madagascar. And I'll start kind of tracing back in time some of the older lineages to the more recent ones that we think in terms of when they colonized Madagascar. So one of the oldest lineages that we think got to Madagascar in terms of modern birds is the elephant bird. And this is a relative of the ostrich. It's a rat type, like other, and which are a group of large flightless birds. And I'm just gonna pause here to give you a fun fact about elephant birds. You see this egg here with David Attenborough for scale. Elephant birds actually lay the largest eggs possible. So physically the largest eggs in terms of being able to be sturdy enough, yet porous to allow air to flow into the embryos. And so, you know, the size of this egg is quite massive. If you think about it, it's more than a foot in length, and really, really amazing when we actually get to see this. This is larger in relation to what an ostrich egg is, which is currently the largest egg that any living creature lays. It's about, I would say, 10 times bigger than an ostrich egg. So the classic model of ratites, these large flightless birds in terms of how they evolved, used to be that when Gondwana split up, these birds got isolated on these respective landmasses. And we think that because, you know, ostriches live in Africa, rheas live in South America, emus and cassowaries in Australia. And so we think that because these were all the land masses that once formed Gondwana, this would have been the sequence of how they broke up and diversified. Well, it turns out that our expectations based on that, or even our expectations of their evolutionary relationships based on the size of these birds and some of their morphological features, turns out was not a good hypothesis. And when we used genetic data and some more fine scale information of their morphology, the evolutionary relationships changed quite a bit. So if you look at the right-hand column, that figure there is showing you the relationships of ratites as we know them today using genetic evidence, including as well as morphological evidence. And you can see that the elephant birds, this big gray thing here, turns out to be most closely related to kiwis from New Guinea, which is kind of, it's very surprising to say the least. They're not only very different in terms of size, but on two different parts of the world. But we think that this is quite possible given the fact that all of these birds were dispersing in some sort of overwater capacity to get to their respective land masses. Kiwis and elephant birds do share some other features in common. Kiwis also lay remarkably big eggs in comparison to their size. And we think that both, just like kiwis, elephant birds were probably nocturnal, given the size of their brains and their olfactory sensory parts of their brain, as well as the smaller size of their visions and senses. Around the same time that the elephant birds were colonizing Madagascar, we also have, let me see if I can get this. Yes, we also have a couple of other really bizarre and unique lineages. The Mezites that you see on the left-hand side here, these are these fairly skulky, very shy, we don't really know much about them, birds. And then the cuckoo roller, which is really bizarre because it doesn't really look like anything else. And so these are birds that have long baffled ornithologists. We didn't know where to put them. We didn't know what they were related to. They don't really share a lot of features with a lot of any of the other birds that we see on other land masses. And turns out they are fairly old and unique lineages. On the right-hand side of the slide is an evolutionary tree of the major lineages of birds. And if you're not familiar with phylogenetic trees, let me quickly explain how to read this. If you go from the right side, all of the tips of those lines, those we call them branches of a tree, those are, the tips are where species are living today. And you can trace back those lines, and where they connect to other branches is how they're related to other lineages. If you can also look at it the other way when we go forward in time. And so when you go forward in time, every time one branch breaks into two, we think of that as a speciation event, right? So we have speciation events every time one branch breaks into two, and then again and again, and that over a long period of time is how we think of how diversification works. So in this evolutionary tree, I want you to notice two things. One, that the very base of this tree, the backbone of this tree, has very, very, very short branches. And this is because modern birds, we think, actually evolved really fast. And so fast that sometimes we really have a hard time understanding their relationships. But the other thing to note is that the cuckoo roller and the mesite, these are branches that go almost back to that base, right? And they don't have any close relatives that are living that we can that we can identify. And so this means that these are really old lineages that have failed to diversify on Madagascar. And maybe this is because sometimes getting to an island makes you an evolutionary dead end. Once you get to an island, it's very hard to move from an island back into the mainland, because you would then be faced with all the competition of all the species that occur in the mainland. And so perhaps they got to Madagascar and then couldn't really go anywhere else. About 10 million years later, we have the appearance of a few other lineages that do manage to become a little bit more diverse. And we can hypothesize perhaps that this is partly due to some of the habitats in Madagascar diversifying and allowing for changes allowing for the endemic fauna to also respond to these changes. And so we have on the left side Ascites, which are subacenes. They're related to other old world subacenes like broadbills and pittas. And on the right side, we have ground rollers, which are related to rollers that are found in Africa and Asia. But unlike the rollers, the ground rollers are very much spend most of their time on the ground, whereas rollers are fairly arboreal. Ascites are a really great example of convergence in evolution. If you look at the extreme left-hand picture, that's the sunbird Ascite. And this is sometimes called a false sunbird because it looks exactly like a sunbird, right? There are times when if you didn't see the wattle, and some of the juveniles don't have such a dramatic wattle, you would think it was a sunbird, but they're very, very, very distantly related to sunbirds. And they only share that characteristic because they both are nectivorous and have that curved bill. About 20 to 15 million years ago, we actually have the appearance of the largest radiations on Madagascar. These are the vangas, the tetrakas, and the kuas, and all of these are diverse in terms of having more than, vangas have about 25 species, tetrakas have about 13, and kuas have, again, 13. So multiple species, and I'll tell you a little bit more about these later on in the talk, but there's something about coming at this time period that was perhaps just favorable enough for them to diversify, and perhaps was also a time when there weren't as much competition, so they could really make use of all the resources. And so there's something about this time period that seems to be driving this incredible diversity of these lineages. And then finally, in the most recent time periods, in the last 1 million or so years, or 2 million years, we have a lot of more recent immigrants. And it turns out a lot of these are actually fairly recently immigrating from Africa. And these are all species that seem to move around fairly easily. They get to some of the other islands that are close to Africa. Islands close to Madagascar, between Africa and Madagascar, and even going into towards Asia. They seem to move around fairly easily. And so we know that from ocean circulation records that during this period, the wind direction was actually flowing from Africa to Madagascar. And so maybe this was what enabled a lot of these species to get there so easily. So how did birds get to Madagascar? So I said that some birds came from Africa, and this is what we should predict. We should predict that most species come from Africa, given how close it is to Madagascar. But you can also see that the further land masses in Asia, if you look really closely, there are some islands that are connecting between between Asian land masses and Madagascar. And they're the little speckles of dots that are actually little islands. And we hypothesize that sometimes birds might have been able to use these islands as stepping stones to be able to get to Madagascar. And when we look at all the lineages that are found in Madagascar, it turns out that only about 1/3 of them are from Africa. Another 1/3 are from the much more distant Asia. And so it doesn't matter about proximity as much as how the excuse me, the environmental conditions were in terms of being able to bring them over to Madagascar. And if we look at who these are, as I explained before, the species that came from Africa include some older lineages and some very, very young lineages, whereas the species that came from Asia are fairly old species. And then there are some that are unclear because they have been around for so long that we can't even tell what their relationships are to other lineages of birds. So how did birds evolve within Madagascar? And in this context, it's interesting to note that Madagascar acts both like an island and sometimes like a mini continent. Our predictions based on island biogeography, this is a theory that predicts that the size of an island or the distance from a mainland can predict the number of species that can live on an island. And so using this model, if we plot other islands, if we plot island size and the number of species that occur on it, and we compare Madagascar to other islands, it turns out Madagascar has a lot fewer birds than predicted by the theory of island biogeography. And one reason for this might be that island biogeography doesn't actually take into account diversification within the island. And so if you look on the right side, you see that Madagascar, for being an island, it's a very large island. It also has quite a diversity of habitats. And these are habitats that the birds can kind of locally adapt to and diversify within. And so we think that one of the explanations might be that there's actually more diversification happening within the island. And as I will allude to later on in the talk, it's possible that we're actually missing some understanding of what the species are. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those really dramatic radiations that I alluded to before. So the vangas are the most diverse group of birds in Madagascar, and they're really dramatic. If you look at all these pictures, you see that they're quite different looking, right? And for a long time, we weren't sure what they were related to, or even if they were related to each other. And this was because they look quite different from each other. But it took an incredible amount of genetic data for us to be able to show that all of this diversity actually rose from a single common ancestor. And that's what those branches are showing you. Also, what's interesting to note is not only did they all look different, but it seems like there's some aspect of their evolution where they are adapted into unique behaviors and conditions in response to the environment in Madagascar. And so, for example, if you look at the colors of these branches, you see that we think that the ancestral population of bangas, the first set of birds to get there, to then evolve into all these different forms, or probably gleaners. They're all insectivores, and they get gleaners get their food from picking it off the substrate. Very close, shortly after they started diversifying, we see that some species started specializing. And so if you look at these blue lineages, these are birds that exclusively sally and catch their prey in midair. And that's fairly unique, even though some other relatives of theirs in the mainland do sally, they do it very rarely. And here's a group that exclusively does that. And then if you look at the orange group, these are species that probe. So they're actually using their bills to pick out the insects and grubs within bark, just like woodpeckers do here in Minnesota. There are no woodpeckers in Madagascar. And so we think that these species are filling that niche, this empty niche. And so they can make use of this and actually do something that's a very similar behavior. And we see this kind of similarity to things that we're familiar with in the mainland in other parts of this tree. For example, on the right side, you see this bird. This is the nuthatch vanga. And if you look at it, it looks very much like a nuthatch. It hangs on the bark of trees, and it goes up and down, climbing around the same way that nuthatches here do. And so we see this kind of example of open niches where there's a chance for birds to occupy and behave like things in other places, even though they're quite distantly related. We wanted to also look at, we know that they're dramatically different from each other in Madagascar, but how different are they from their close relatives? So we also explored this by looking at their morphological features in more detail. And when we look at the size of their bills, especially, the bills seem to be the most dramatic feature that that's quite variable in this group. And so if we look at the bills of these birds, the green dots are the ones on the left-hand side of the graph. The green dots are the ones that are the Malagasy species, and you see that all of the green dots are skewed towards the larger sizes. And so we know that their bills are much larger than their close relatives. And on the right side is a graph that shows you the amount of variation that is in these bills, or we call it disparity. And so if you look at the red outline, those are the Malagasy species, and you see that the red outline is much, much bigger than the black outline, which is the non-Malagasy relatives. And you can see this shows us that this is quite different. They're not only evolving differently once they get to Madagascar, but it's a huge shift from what their ancestral forms were. And this gives us really good evidence for what we call adaptive radiation, just like the Darwin's finches and the Hawaiian honeycreepers. This rotating model on the top is how we measured some of these features. This is a model, a 3D model of bird bills using photogrammetry, and we can use this, once we have a digital model like this, we can use this to actually quantify the amount of variation and the amount of shape information in these. And so this is actually a really fun tool, and my student made this model, and we have a lot of, and he made models for all of the other species, and that's what this information is based on. Just like the vangas, the tetrakas or the bernierids are another adaptive radiation or endemic radiation, but I'm sure it would surprise you to know that we actually didn't even know about this family until 2 decades ago, until the year 2000. This family, all of these species in this family were placed into other widespread families. So for a long time, some of these species looked like bulbuls, and so those were placed in the bulbul family. Some of them looked like warblers, the old world warblers, the sylviids, and so they were placed with the old world warblers, and some were thought to be babblers. And then it turns out that they're not bulbuls, warblers, or babblers at all. They're actually an endemic family that share a common ancestor. And it tells you something about how diverse they are if they were placed in 3 very different families and then turn out to all share a single common ancestor. And so this is really exciting. And again, something that we really needed genetic data to help us uncover. And not only is that aspect of their evolution really interesting, they also have kind of a bizarre story in terms of their biogeography. Turns out the closest relatives to Tetrachus, to this family Breckenridge, is this really, again, unusual bird called Donacobius. So this is a bird that is placed in its own family, a single species in its own family, and it was always something that baffled people for a long time. We thought they were related to wrens, and it turns out they're not related to wrens. They are related to birds in Madagascar. And Donacobius, they only live in the swamps of South America. So again, quite just different parts of the world. And together, they're most closely related to Locustellidae, which are reed warblers and bush warblers in the old world. So what's interesting here is if you look at the relatives, the close relatives of the Tetrachus, they are birds that live in swamps or in grasslands or other open habitat. And all of the birds in Madagascar are almost exclusively forest species. So again, the shift in what they're doing, how they have adapted to what's in Madagascar. So it's a real dramatic shift. And when we looked at the morphology, again, very similar to what the Vangas were showing us, we see quite a difference in terms of what the Breckenridge are doing as opposed to their close relatives. So if the reddish circles here are the Breckenridges, and the bluish ones are their close relatives. And again, you see that they're in quite different parts of these graphs. So the last group I want to talk about is the kuas, and this is something we are still working on. We don't have as much data on, but I couldn't resist. They're just so cool looking. They all have these great blue eye patches and have really, really dramatic coloration. And my favorite is this blue kua, the one on the lower right here, which is just the most amazing color. Kuas are from the family cuckoos and the order cuckoos. And in Madagascar, we have 2 groups, a group that is terrestrial, so they spend all their time on the ground, and a group that is arboreal, they spend their time up in the trees. And it turns out their close relatives are ground cuckoos from Asia. So again, we see this, the suggestion that perhaps this lineage is doing something different on Madagascar than it does in other areas. I want to shift now to talking a little bit about conservation and the importance of why we do this work. So we do this work because studying diversification patterns can tell us a lot about evolution and ecology, but it also tells us a lot that's important for conservation, right? And the most important thing that we do in our work is to examine all the species that we're looking at to see if there's actually a sign of hidden diversity. And a lot of these species, just like the example that I told you with the Breckenridges, the taxonomy can be misleading. Sometimes we call something one species, and it turns out that they actually have a lot of distinct lineages within them. And in this case, each of these species were split into 2, and actually in the case of the Breckenridge, it was split into 3 species. So in the past it was called one species, and now we find using genetic data, using morphology, using all of the information that we can in modern times, using behavior and ecology, we can actually show that these are 3 distinct lineages. And so just in the 2 groups that we've spent the most amount of time analyzing, we've increased the diversity in Madagascar by 8 species. And that's pretty amazing, right? That's a pretty big change. And it's a change that, you know, there's a lot of controversy in terms of elevating species from subspecies to species. But in this case, we have a lot of evidence that the taxonomy of Madagascar is really not accurate. It's really not telling us enough information, enough in-depth information for what we need to be able to prioritize what we need to do for conservation. So now that we know this, we can use these species boundaries, we can use the areas that we know species are restricted to also help us identify areas that are important for conservation. And we know this is also really important because we want to be able to use the information that we are getting from our studies to also look at the impact of habitat and climate change. In Madagascar, deforestation is advancing very rapidly. And we already can see the effects of this by noticing local extinctions and the fact that there are in several cases, there are isolated populations that are so small that they will not be viable in the long term. And so we need to be able to address this by looking at these types of data and being able to work with local people to really advance the cause of conservation. And on the left side, I have some examples of some of the more recently extinct species. The eggshells that you see on the left-hand side picture is eggshells from elephant birds. And these are birds that we think went extinct less than 500 years ago, shortly after humans arrived on Madagascar. Humans seem to have arrived on Madagascar fairly late in terms of thinking about how human migration happened across the world. So even though it's very close to Madagascar, it was actually first colonized from the other way, from Asia, just like some of the birds that I was talking about. So humans get to Madagascar fairly late. They coexisted for a while with elephant birds, but given the size of the elephant birds, they were probably fairly delicious, as well as their eggs were probably fairly good for feeding large families. And so they went extinct fairly easily. But you can still find lots of eggshell fragments on beaches in Madagascar. The picture in the middle is the snail-eating kua. And this is something we actually have some specimens in some museums of. And this is something we think went extinct less than 200 years ago. So very, very recent. And again, a unique behavior. They use their bills to be able to pry open snail shells. And again, they lived on coastal environments. And so coastal environments are also probably the most vulnerable in terms of surviving human migration. And with that, I want to say thank you for your attention. I do want to also acknowledge all the people that have helped me with my work. I'd be happy to tell you more details as we go along, but I want to stop here now and acknowledge the people in my lab that have really helped to produce a lot of the information that I showed you today, as well as my collaborators from Madagascar on the right-hand side. And then I want to make the point that I'd like to dedicate this talk to a former student and good friend of mine, Lenika Strozier, who we lost to COVID this year. Lenika did her master's thesis on Madagascar birds, and she was a real inspiration, a really amazing person. She had this lively personality. She worked incredibly hard, and it was just such a tragic loss for us in many ways. Also because she is one of the very, very few Black scientists that we have. And so I would want to just use this as a reminder that we really need to work hard to encourage people from diverse communities to be to care about the importance of science and nature, and also to encourage them to be a part of this community. We all enjoy learning about diversity. We all understand the importance of biodiversity, but this can only be sustained if we can bring in people from underrepresented groups. And so I urge you, if we all can in some way try to commit supporting this, supporting underrepresented groups and their exposure to science in some way. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you very, very much. If people have questions, we've still got about 80 people in the room. If you could put those questions into the chat, and then Stu, you could feed from there.
Sure.
While
While we're waiting, I actually have a question, and I want to thank you, Dr. Reddy. Very good talk and nice inspirational message there at the end. The question I have is about species richness on Madagascar. You talked about birds having less species richness. Is that true? Do you know for other taxa as well, like bats and insects?
You know, that's a good question. I actually haven't looked it up for other groups, but definitely for mammals as a whole. As I showed you, it's a much smaller representation of the mammal groups. But within each of those groups, there's quite a diversity. So I'm not sure. I think I'm not sure if we compare that to other islands, what Madagascar would look like in mammals, but that's a good question. I should ask my mammalogy friends.
Okay, thank you. Gordon asks, can you talk about the 15 species of vangas that are in 15 different genera? Does Rainforest Trust work in Madagascar to save habitat? So 2 questions from Gordon.
Thanks. So I can talk a lot about them. I'm not sure what you want to hear specifically about them. These are the representatives of the different genera, and within each of them, most of them are monotypic, so they're only represented by a single species, but a few of them, like Newtonia and Cenoporostris, actually have multiple species in them. And so if you think about the diversity, representing the diversity of kind of the broad diversity of the group, this is a good representation based on their based on genus. In terms of the Rainforest Alliance, I'm less familiar with Rainforest Alliance being playing a big role in the conservation efforts there, but that doesn't mean that they don't. There are lots of conservation NGOs that do a lot in Madagascar. So WWF is a really big player, the Nature Conservancy, and WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society. And then my collaborator is actually part of the Field Museum that spends a lot of time doing surveys as well as conservation efforts. And they're also part of a local NGO called Association Bahatra, and they work with some of the other international NGOs to help do surveys as well as train local scientists. And a lot of the national parks are supported by funding from international NGOs.
Okay, thank you. Adele asks, what about Madagascar's birds of prey? Are serpent eagles endemic?
You know, there are a couple of species of accipiters, and they're all independently colonizing. They've all independently come into Madagascar, and so they have. And what's really interesting about raptors there is you have kind of a size variation in the hawks. So you have a small hawk, a medium-sized hawk, and a larger hawk. But there are no serpent eagles, as far as I know. And if they are, they're visiting from Africa.
Okay. Terrence asks, are there any wading birds in Madagascar and other waterfowl? Are there wetlands?
Quite a lot. I did not include them in this analysis because I was very much focused on looking at endemic radiation, so groups that have diversified within Madagascar are not restricted to the island. a lot of the waterfowl, there are some endemic waterfowl that are only found here, but a lot of them do end up kind of traveling between islands and seem to have more widespread distributions. But we don't know enough about them. And this is another example where there was a recent case where not quite waterfowl, but water-like birds, where there was a rail that was newly discovered and brand new to science. So, you know, there's still a lot that we can learn about this.
Barbasks are invasive species a problem in Madagascar?
Yes, but not as much as it seems like a lot of the invasive species are more recent. And so right now it's kind of interesting that they actually have an invasion of house sparrows. And it turns out to be a very recent invasion. And this is kind of surprising given how close they are to where house sparrows naturally live and how widespread the natural population of house sparrows across Eurasia is. But it seems like they're starting to invade, and they think that they come from shipping lines. So they come across on ships and then get established along the coasts. And they've been established now in like 2 different parts of the island, and they're starting to spread.
Lori asks, what is the number of species of birds in Madagascar, and how many are in danger of extinction?
So there are about 200 species of birds that are restricted to the island that are found. There are a few vagrants, things that show up once in a while, but 200 is about the number in terms of the endemics. And I don't have an accurate figure of how many of them are endangered, unfortunately, but I would suspect that at least a quarter of them.
Okay. Stephen asked, or really is a statement. He says, you are the co-author of a recent paper on Gentoo penguins. How do people connect on research projects like these?
That's a really great question. So I had a postdoc who actually is, she's in one of these pictures in the end, who did her, so Jane Younger, the person next to me here in red with the blonde hair. So she was she did her thesis project on penguins when she was in Australia, and she had a lot of expertise in population analyses and phylogenetics. And so I hired her to be my postdoc when I got a grant to study the birds of Madagascar. And she was really excited to kind of diversify her scope of work. And then when she got to my lab, she learned some other techniques beyond genomics. She learned about morphometrics and other things, and that's my contribution to studying the gentoos in ways that she hadn't done before. And we put that together and came up with looking at gentoo penguins from both a genetic and a morphological manner.
Terrence asks, have there been any introduced predators that have caused extinction? For example, rodents that have caused extinction, and what bird species have become extinct because of as a result?
That's a good question. So I don't know specifically what birds might have gone extinct, but there are ratus, which is kind of the most widespread rodent that seems to be able to easily travel with humans and go across to different oceanic islands, and they wreak havoc in a lot of places. And in Madagascar, they are destroying habitats as well as spreading diseases. So there are parts of Madagascar that actually still have the plague, and this is a rodent-borne disease. And you know, it has to be something that we don't know if that has an impact on the wildlife as much, but it definitely has an impact on the human population.
Okay. But Richard asks, how about the tough shells on those elephant eggs? How could they last on beaches for 500 years?
That's amazing. And I actually haven't seen this, but I dream about it. It's almost this cottage industry. And for a long time, local people would go and collect these eggshells and piece them back together, kind of like jigsaw puzzles. And so if you Google elephant bird egg, you'll actually see that some of them are ones that people have kind of fitted back together to create a whole. And so a lot of the eggs that we do know about are fragmented eggs that people have been able to piece back together. But we do have a few whole eggs, and we actually have some that they've CT scanned and showed to been able to find an embryo within. And we can actually model what the embryo looked like. It's pretty cool. And there's also, sorry, one more thing. People, when they do find whole eggs, they can actually use them as like water bottles, which some people in Africa also do. So with ostrich eggs, and so they're pretty hardy.
Terrence asks, is there a lot of ecotourism on Madagascar? You did research on the island, but are there public birding tours?
They are, and there's some pretty good ones, and I'd be happy to recommend one or two of them. The ecotourism is actually pretty well structured. So there are several places where they have well-established parks that have good facilities and really good set of local guides that will help you find all of the species that you're looking for. And the bird guides are especially great. They will find you all of the unique things that you need. And so they're kind of trained to work with photographers. And when I got to travel around, I actually took my family there for an ecotourism trip. And everyone in Madagascar is incredibly nice, incredibly friendly, and very soft-spoken. And so they know that this is a good industry for them, and so they're willing to really put effort into it. So there are a couple of really well-maintained parks. That being said, the ones that are not well supported by tourists don't seem to last as well in terms of some of the slash and burn, as well as some of the bushmeat that people end up doing.
Okay, there's a question about frogs on Madagascar. So what can you tell us about frogs, if anything, on Madagascar?
Well, I know a little bit about frogs in Madagascar. They're actually quite diverse. And again, we think that there's several groups, several large families of frogs in Madagascar that have radiated in a similar manner to the lemurs or the vangas, and seem to be quite diverse in terms of their sizes and their ecologies. And for a while, we were sure that the frogs might actually track some of the biogeography in terms of how Gondwana split, but we think that they're actually fairly recent, just like the birds and mammals. So the lizards and frogs probably rafted the same way that other creatures, other vertebrates did. And this is kind of surprising, given that they really don't tolerate salt water, and so they were still able to raft on these big mats of vegetation.
Another question about tourism in Madagascar. Do people speak English there? And how are the roads?
The roads are actually fairly good, which is, well, no, I will take that back. Some roads are good and some roads are horrendous. I think my daughter, but she was very young at the time, but she did get sick on some of the winding roads. Some of the better roads are unfortunately good because of a lot of investment by China, and China is really interested in the rosewood that is in Madagascar and being able to get that. Currently that's illegal, and it's a very limited trade for being able to export rosewood, but there seems to be quite a lot of illegal ways of being able to do this. And so every so often you'll hear about that they confiscated a whole bunch of illegally logged rosewood. And Madagascar was a former French colony. And so by most of the business happens in French. And this is mostly in the big cities, but in the towns, there are various dialects of Malagasy that are that vary across the region. So English is actually, it's hard to get around the island just knowing English. It helps to have a guide that speaks English or some knowledge of French.
Okay. Well, we're right at 8 o'clock. So I think we might finish there. There are a few more questions, but I didn't want to keep you here forever. So,
well, I appreciate the turnout. I'm really excited that we had a good number of people who came.
Yeah. Many people commented on what a good presentation it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. That was great. We will, if anybody's listening, we will have this recorded and hopefully up on the website. So if anybody missed it or wasn't able to make it, we should have it available on the event page.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All right.
guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, Richard. Hey, Julian. I saw Julian go by.
Thank you, Ben, for keeping us all organized.
You got it. This is learning more and more about this. Did you see that one note went by? Somebody reported that one of the other Audubon groups had 130 people show up and 30 couldn't log in.
Yes.
They opted in 100.
Yeah.
We were at 83. I was watching it pretty carefully to see if we.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seemed like it went pretty smoothly though tonight. I appreciate that.
I keep my hands away from the keyboard. It helps.
Okay.
I thought it was excellent. And one question I had is the very first meeting of the year still on the website?
It is not. The first one I blew it. There were too many things going on. I locked half the group out because some people got a link with the password and some didn't, and the recording.
Yeah, you know, that's why we missed it. And so I wondered if
recording didn't get started. I apologize. That was a learning curve, but we've done better since then. So
yes, no, it's a tremendous effort, and we appreciate all the effort that you're doing.
well, what's fun is we invited 13